Hi there, I'm Russ. I'm one of the directors of Rent a Room, a HMO specialist letting agency in the Midlands. We cover various areas, including Atherstone, Bedworth, Coventry, Hinckley, Nuneaton, Tamworth, Rugby. And we are presenting at the moment a summary of the Renters' Rights Act changes as we see them applying to the HMO market, particularly where you've got individual renters with their own AST contracts currently in the HMO. We are a HMO letting agency specialist. We manage around 600 rooms in the area. We've been going since 2018 and we have a staff team of 10 supported by numerous subcontractors that we employ to make sure that your properties are well managed, well maintained, full, efficient and profitable. As part of our process for our existing landlords, this presentation is being provided in advance of a consultation call to go through not only the Renters' Rights Act changes, but also look at your energy costs, your other running costs, and to see whether or not we can make your property more efficient, more profitable for you as a landlord. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Renters' Rights Act, but before we start, I just want to say this presentation is aimed at landlords with HMOs where the tenants have their own ASTs. So we're not talking, although the legislation applies to all tenancies, we're not today talking about family lets or student HMOs particularly. We're talking about this in relation to the changes that will affect the HMOs that we manage, so individually occupied HMOs. Just to say as well, this presentation is not authoritative or exhaustive, and it's certainly not intended to be legal advice, and it's entirely separate from any HMO licensing or planning condition rules which might apply. I'll touch on these things as we go through potentially, but again, because I'm not giving you a full guide, I'm really talking about how the Renters' Rights Act changes will affect the type of HMO properties that we manage in particular. Okay, here we go. So the background to this is that this legislation has been brewing for about 3 or 4 years under both Labour and the previous Conservative government. This image on the right here is myself, one of our property managers, meeting our local MP to discuss some of the unintended consequences that we felt might come as a result of this legislation. To be fair, the government do listen and have made some changes over the course of this legislation passing through Parliament. But it is broadly the same as the Conservative bill that was started 3 or 4 years ago, primarily under Michael Gove, and was then sort of led and championed by Angela Rayner for a period. And now the current Housing Secretary has made this pass through Parliament. A number of the changes have already come into place. The most significant of these changes starts on the 1st of May, and there are some additional changes over the next few years which we'll talk about. Broadly speaking, the government obviously intend to do good things for people. I would say there are always unintended consequences of any legislation, and I'm going to talk through a couple of these as I see them coming up over the next few months and years. But essentially, they're saying that their intent is to change the imbalance of power between the landlord and tenant. Now, as a landlord, you probably think that tenants have all the rights, and as tenants, probably you feel that landlords have the balance of power. So what the government are trying to do is, based on all the information they've been given, is to try and balance that out a bit. The key things that you'll likely have heard about is ending the no-fault evictions to give tenants more security. And this, on the face of it, is a good thing, that tenants who rent a property should be able to make it their home and feel like they're not going to be evicted at short notice. The reality, of course, is that the majority of Section 21, the so-called non-fault evictions, are often used because there is a reason for the tenant to leave. Sometimes it's the tenant's fault, it's the way the tenancy has been conducted, and the landlord simply wants to use the most reliable route to get possession. And often it will be a change of circumstances, meaning that the landlord wants to do something different with the property and the current tenants need to leave. The middle ground is where landlords have been using it to, for example, remove a good tenant who can't pay the new market rent for a property and they want to remove that tenant in order to achieve a higher rent. And that I can understand why the government are trying to address that. Overall, it also aims to improve the standards of accommodation, which again, from our perspective, we manage good quality accommodation. We won't put our name to poor quality accommodation. However, there are, of course, in the industry, lots of landlords who don't necessarily know what standards people are expecting today, and therefore their property falls short of that, and they probably do need additional powers by the local authority to improve the standard of accommodation that people are living in. The other headlines are the removal of discrimination against pets, tenants with children, and tenants on universal credit. And this is one of the areas where, in particular, we will talk about the specific impact of this on HMO tenants and properties versus tenants in general. It also aims to strengthen the local authorities' ability to enforce the things they can enforce about and the amount of money they can fine landlords for not complying. It also strengthens the tenants' ability to apply for rent repayment orders, i.e. to get their money back where the landlord has not followed the rules properly. So we'll move on now just to cover the overall. So these are the sections listed on the government website about the things they're trying to do. So abolish Section 21 evictions, ensure that possession grounds are fair to both landlords and tenants. Some of the timelines for notices being issued have changed. That rent reviews are conducted annually, and therefore the tenant knows that the rent isn't going to continually increase, and they can better anticipate when changes are going to be made to the amount of money they're expected to pay. It also strengthens the ability to challenge those rent increases if they're not fair. It introduces an ombudsman, so like many industries, there will now be an independent adjudicator who can basically stand up for tenants if a landlord has done something wrong. It will create a private rented sector database, so similar to what Wales have in Rent Smart Wales, a database which lists all landlords and all properties that those landlords are associated with. Think of it like Trustpilot for landlords. This legislation will also give tenants additional rights to request a pet, which can't reasonably refuse. Again, something which we will touch on specifically in relation to HMOs later on. It will apply the current decent home standards to the private rental sector. Again, for a lot of our landlords, this won't really be anything to worry about because the quality of accommodation is already at the correct level. But there are obviously a lot of properties out there in the rental market which are not and do need to be improved. AWAB's law will be extended to the private rental sector, and this relates to damp and mould. It gives landlords clearer guidance and more responsibility for dealing with the causes of damp and mould. And hopefully it will also come with some education for tenants about how lifestyle affects these as well. It will make it illegal for landlords and agents to discriminate against prospective tenants who are in receipt of benefits or who have children. Again, we will touch on the intricacies of that when it comes to HMOs later. It will end the practice of rental bidding, which I think is largely geographic and probably seasonal. But essentially it's to say that when you advertise a property, that is the price that someone is going to pay or less. You're not going to create an auction environment where it goes to the highest bidder. As we've already said, it strengthens local authority enforcement, it strengthens their ability to enforce and the amount they can fine landlords for not complying. The other significant change that has already come into place here is that the local authorities that issue the fines now keep the fine. So it sort of creates a financial incentive for them to take enforcement action. Hopefully they will do this in a fair way. But equally, if you get to the point of being fined by the local authority, you've probably already ignored a number of warnings about what you need to do. And then, as we said before, it strengthens the rent repayment orders, whereby tenants can reclaim rent which has been taken for a tenancy which has not been conducted properly. Okay, let's get straight into the various changes which have been made, and I'll talk a little bit about how they're going to affect HMO properties in particular. The full timeline of this change, and I will thank the National Residential Landlords Association for this table. It's freely available on their website. It's good information and they've got a lot of great advice on there that you can read as well. So some of these changes have already been made. As we said, in December last year, the council enforcement measures and investigatory powers have changed. The wording for new tenancy agreements has already been confirmed, and the information sheet for new and existing tenants to inform them about the changes has already been published. The 1st of May is the next significant milestone. This is where all existing contracts essentially cease and become assured periodic tenancies, and the ability to serve a Section 21 notice ends. In the spring and summer of 2026, the penalties for Category 1 hazards will be updated, and at the end of May is the deadline for serving the information sheet to existing tenants to inform them about the changes. And the deadline for using existing Section 21 notices is the 31st of July. So if you're in the process of or have already served a notice to a tenant using Section 21, you have until the end of July to make sure that that is used to then apply to court. After that point, you won't be able to apply to the court to enforce that notice. Some of the Renters' Rights Act reforms will then be introduced to the social rented sector later in 2027. This time next year, the government expects the courts to be more efficient through the further use of digital technology. The Ombudsman is expected to be introduced by 2028 at the latest, and that will be the point at which it will be mandatory for landlords to be a member of that Ombudsman. And then, interestingly, the government have said that in 2 years' time, they will publish an initial evaluation of the changes of this Act, and that in 3 years beyond that, i.e. 5 years from now, it will also be reviewed again. So hopefully some of the unintended consequences which come to light, some of which I think are glaringly obvious, some of the others may not be quite so obvious at this point, hopefully they can be ironed out and changed at that point there. So the key actions that we need to take as an industry, if you're a landlord that we're managing for, we will manage a lot of this for you. The first step is that by the 1st of May, on the 1st of May, we will start issuing all existing tenants with the new information sheet, which you can see a screenshot of page 1 of that on the right hand side of the screen here. So that information essentially tells tenants the new rights and the changes that are being made to renting. It's a bit like the How to Rent guide, but it is essentially, if you're already in a tenancy, it's telling them what's changing. Any tenancy that is already existing from the 1st of May becomes an assured periodic tenancy. So whereas at the moment it's an assured short hold, it's now an assured periodic tenancy. And any new tenancies starting from the 1st of May must use the assured periodic tenancy template to ensure that it is compliant with the current legislation. We will be using in Rent-A-Room the template provided by the National Residential Landlords Association, and that means that we will be very confident that we will have all of the correct information in our tenancy agreements to ensure that landlords are well protected. Rent reviews will then only be able to be done once in a 12-month period. We are proposing that we will do it on the anniversary of the tenancy start date, and that we will initiate that process 10 weeks before the anniversary. That gives us 2 weeks to research and propose the new rent, and then the new rent must be informed to the tenants using a specific form, so that it can then, with 2 months notice, so that it comes into force on the first anniversary of the tenancy starting. When a property becomes available to rent, whether that's for the first time or for re-advertising, we will make sure that we do not advertise it without the landlord's agreement. So we will propose what the market rent is at that point, and we will agree with the landlord that we will advertise the rent at. And this is partly because once it's online, it can't then be changed, certainly can't be up, it can be moved down to comply with the new rental bidding rules. But essentially this is us working in partnership with you, so that if we then get a really popular response to that advert, we can't then say, oh, we should have put it up for more, because we both looked at the data and we agreed what the correct rent for that would be. The fact that it's really popular is obviously down to good marketing, great photos, and a well-positioned HMO. The no rent in advance rules, again, this doesn't particularly apply because we don't take large rent in advance payments anyway. But what it does mean is a slight change, which we'll talk about later on, whereby the tenant gets the keys regardless of whether or not they've made payment, and that we can't ask them to make payment before they've collected the keys. But we'll touch on that further in the presentation. Later on in 2026, the private rental sector database, so that is the database of landlords and their properties, that will begin to be rolled out on a regional basis, and the Ombudsman will not be introduced, we don't believe, until next year, and all the information currently says that it will not be mandatory until 2028, so more information on that to follow. And then beyond next year, AWAB's law will be implemented. That's the damp and mould law. Again, most of our properties, I would say, are not in any way at risk of being affected by that rule because our properties are well managed and well monitored. But we're not yet sure the exact date on which that legislation will become effective. And then the decent home standards, again, that will be applied to the rental sector at some point in the future, but we are, again, confident that the vast majority of our properties are way in excess of that standard, and that any that are not, we are already in touch with the landlords about making those improvements because we don't rent poor quality accommodation anyway. So, in what has changed then? The main questions we're being asked at the moment by landlords are about ending tenancies, because that's what the government and the sort of media have led with, the end of Section 21. Well, the reality is that most good professional landlords aren't removing good tenants who are paying the rent for no reason. Occasionally it will happen where the rent falls so significantly behind and the tenant can't afford it that the landlord decides to take the property back, but that's very, very rare in our experience. The vast majority of times that we would use a Section 21 is where we want to ensure that we're going to get a definite result at court, because there is no discretion with the Section 21. The judge cannot refuse to grant possession so long as the tenancy was set up and managed correctly during the term of the tenancy. So at the moment that will be removed, and we will have to rely on various grounds on the Section 8 notice, which we currently do and we use very successfully when we need to, but all of the grounds essentially will now be in the Section 8. The main change, which we'll start with from a landlord perspective, is that tenants must now give you 2 months notice to leave the tenancy. That currently is 1 month, so in a sense that is one of the things that the government are saying, look, landlords, we've given you in return is that the tenants need to give you more notice if they're going to leave. Now, in practice, for a HMO tenant, I think the reality is that if you're more transient, which you are by virtue of being in a HMO, you don't have council tax, you don't have bills, you don't have furniture, you can just pack your bags and leave at short notice. Now, this is often younger people who are climbing the career ladder or perhaps moving because of starting a new relationship. 1 month's notice is normally adequate for us to re-advertise the room, get interest and arrange a new tenancy. There'll be a short void period in between, of course, where we're going to clean and make sure the room is up to standard. But if you're moving for work in particular, it may be that you're applying for jobs, but you don't yet want to give your notice to leave because you don't necessarily know which job you're going to get. You're then successful in your application for a new job and you're offered a role in another part of the country. Your notice at work is typically a month, 4 weeks, and your new employer is going to want you to start fairly quickly. So you're then going to say to your landlord, look, I've got this new job, I'm moving up to Newcastle, wherever, and I'm off. So I'll be off in about a month. But the landlord's going to say, but you need to give me 2 months' notice now. That's all I've really got in the Renters' Rights Act changes. So I'm going to hold you to that 2 months. Now, hopefully, one would expect that we would be able to re-let that room, and the void period would be less than the month between the month where the tenant wants to leave and the 2 months that the landlord is owed. So we can try and reduce down that period and hopefully negotiate between landlord and tenant that it's a very short void. Perhaps they'll have to pay slightly more than the 1 month's notice that they would otherwise have given, but we can try and keep that void to a minimum. However, if that's not the case, because now good tenants who are moving into the area are having to give 2 months notice to their landlord, we might create a longer gap between tenancies. And because the rules around deposits haven't changed, we can still only take 5 weeks worth of rent from the tenant in advance. We're a bit concerned that we might end up at the end of a really good tenancy where both parties have been happy with a slightly artificially created disagreement about the payment of rent. And if landlords then decide that, well, contractually I'm owed this money, if I'm going to issue a money claim online, it's going to leave potentially a bitter taste in the mouth of tenants who are essentially just, living their lives. However, those are the rules, and landlords may well want to take that up and make that decision to chase that money. And obviously then that's their right, and we will help do that. But really our aim is going to be to reduce the void down between the two tenancies, such that the landlord isn't chasing the tenant for any significant amount of money. The other change, which doesn't necessarily affect most of our rooms because they're single occupancy, but it will affect couples, it will affect people in single lets where there's more than one tenant, and especially student HMOs. The government are now working that the notice is on the basis of one out, all out. That means that if one person says they're leaving the tenancy ends and everybody else is leaving. It's an interesting dynamic how that works, where perhaps we would see in a HMO room that's big enough to have a couple, we've agreed that the couple can live there, that let's say as a result of a relationship breakdown, one person wants to leave, but the other person is happy to stay and continue the tenancy. We would ordinarily then re-reference the remaining tenant, and if they can pass affordability for the room, which, let's be honest, with a 10% uplift for a second tenant is probably fairly achievable, that they can do the tenancy on their own. But perhaps they're the half of the couple that maybe didn't work for whatever reason. They don't have the income. It's an interesting question then about enforcing that notice. If one person's left and the other person stays, but the one out has been activated, essentially we could end up in a situation where one person wants to stay and is in the property, and we're having to enforce the tenant's notice rather than the landlord's notice. At the beginning of every tenancy, there'll be a 12-month protected period, which means that for the vast majority of these, the reasons why landlords might ordinarily use a Section 21, at the moment, those reasons can't be used in the first 12 months after the 1st of May. So, for example, if you let a property to someone and then you decide, oh no, I want to do something different with this property, I shouldn't have let it, you can't ask a tenant to leave. You can't serve the notice within the first 12 months. Whereas at the moment, you could do that towards the end of their fixed period, which might only be 6 months. The reason for this, for example, is so let's say you decide you're going to sell the property, or you want your child to move back into it because they've come home to the area or whatever. Essentially, what the government is saying is, look, you let that tenant have that property, and they, in good faith, want to make it their home, and therefore to ask them to leave after a few months is not fair. And I think most people would say that's a fairly reasonable position to take. So the idea is that it's protecting the tenancy from that. From kind of like backdoor evictions, if you like. However, if it's based on non-payment of rent, breach of tenancy, no right to rent, a fault, then the notices can still be served within that 12-month period. So it doesn't mean that tenants have the right to do whatever they want within 12 months without consequence. If they're not managing the tenancy as they should, then these notice periods can be applied. So if somebody doesn't pay for 3 months, we can now serve them a notice that we're going to give them 4 weeks to either get their payments under control, or we will apply to the court to enforce the notice for them to leave. Now, currently that stands at 2 months, so a second payment must be missed before the notice can be served, and then it gives them 2 weeks from that notice to before we go to court. That now changes to 3 payments missed if they're monthly payments, or 13 if they're weekly payments. and then the notice is 4 weeks. If there is any breach of tenancy or deterioration of the property as a result of what the tenant is doing in there, then we can give them a 4-week notice to rectify and change their behaviour, or we will apply to court for an order for them to be ordered to leave. We'll still need to go to court. We'll still, if they don't leave because of that notice, we'll still need to go to court. We'll still need to get the order. We'll still probably then be given 14 days to leave at that point, and potentially if they don't leave, then the bailiffs will need to be called. None of that process is changing. But if there are these reasons, then these are the notices that they're given before we can apply to court. If the tenant has no right to rent, then essentially they're given 2 weeks to rectify that. And then at that point we would then be able to go to court on the basis they don't have the right to rent in the UK, which again would be their breach of their responsibilities as a tenant. Also, severe antisocial behaviour which requires a conviction would mean that you could give an immediate notice. Essentially, you could say to a tenant, tomorrow we are going to apply to the court to have you removed. That does mean that essentially you're telling them to leave immediately. But in reality, if they don't leave, it's going to be a number of weeks until you get to court. And if the antisocial behaviour relates to their behaviour within the property, there will have been obviously the time lag between the allegation of the offence and the conviction for that offence. And it's the conviction which makes it a mandatory ground to go to court to enforce the order. Then there are discretionary grounds, which means that we can serve the notice and we can apply to court. Some of these notices periods you'll see are quite a bit shorter, but it does mean then that the judge will still have the discretion as to whether or not they think it's reasonable to ask the tenant to end the tenancy on that basis. So if a suitable alternative accommodation is available, so for example, perhaps you've got 2 rental properties, you've done one up, you want to do the other one up, you ask the tenant to move from one property to the other, it's only down the road, you could ask them to leave with 2 months notice, and if they don't, you could go to court and the judge might say, well, actually the landlord's been pretty reasonable here, they're giving you a better quality accommodation, they've given you 2 months to leave, probably if you offer to pay the moving costs, for example, then they would use their discretion to say that that is reasonable to have asked them to move within that 2-month period. If there are any rent arrears or late payment, which is the most common reason that we evict a tenant, then you could ask them to go with 4 weeks notice. But if you decide to go to court using that 4-week notice, it would be up to the judge to decide whether or not you were being too harsh at that point. So it might be perhaps that you've had this tenancy for 3 or 4 years, the tenant is constantly late, never pays on time, is always slightly in arrears but never 2 months fully in arrears. You could say, look, enough's enough, you've got 4 weeks to get on top of this and pay on time in the future, or I'm going to go to the court and say, look, I've had enough, it's been 4 years of this, it's now time to ask them to leave. So that is possible. And equally, I think if somebody moves in and emails you and says, I have no intention of ever paying anything at all for this tenancy, then I think you would serve them a notice that says, please leave within 4 weeks, and then you could go to court. And I hope then that the judge would say, look, the tenant has no intention of paying this tenancy at all. My discretion is that it is reasonable to ask them to leave. So you can see here that this isn't quite how it's been positioned in the media as you can't ever evict another tenant ever again. But it's about being clear for landlords and clear for tenants the situations in which those tenancies can be brought to an end. If there's a breach of tenancy other than payment of rent, so for example, antisocial behaviour, breaching rules, maybe having a pet when you've been given reasonable refusal, then you can ask the tenant to leave with 2 weeks notice. But again, it would be a discretion of the judge as to whether or not they think it's fair what you've asked them to do. The same with deterioration of property or furniture. You can give them 2 weeks to leave, but it's at the judge's discretion. If you use it as a mandatory ground, you have to give the tenant longer to rectify or leave. But then when you get there, then the court has no reason other than to use that because it's a mandatory ground. However, of course, they will have to agree that you've evidenced the deterioration or the breach of tenancy, and that's where there's still an element of, is the court going to decide that this is what I say it is? A conviction for an antisocial behaviour does mean that you can give an immediate notice to leave, but again, you've got that lag between allegation and conviction. The conviction is what makes it an immediate notice, and I would also question whether or not, if you're convicted of antisocial behaviour because you've had a fight in the town 5 miles away, but that has no effect on your tenancy, will the judge say that that is a reason to leave your property if you're behaving properly at home? If your antisocial behaviour that you were convicted of is in your property, then I would assume that the judge would give reasonable consideration to the fact that you've been convicted for antisocial behaviour in that property, and therefore it's right that the landlord's asked you to leave. For social landlords, they will be able to use domestic violence, domestic abuse as a discretionary ground for ending a tenancy, but not yet in the private rental sector. For rioting or for a false statement, this is the interesting one, the notice is 2 weeks. So if a tenant obtained a tenancy and then it turns out that they obtained that tenancy on the basis of providing false information, you would have the right to give them 2 weeks to leave and then go to court to ask the court to enforce that notice if they didn't leave. Again, it's a discretionary ground, so that means that the judge is going to decide whether or not that's a fair reason for the tenant to leave. So, for example, if they gave you misleading information about their employment and it came to light that they were about to be fired and they knew that, and therefore they're not going to be able to afford this accommodation, the judge might say, well, but they are maintaining the property, they are paying the rent, and therefore my decision is that although they did give you false information, they can stay. However, they might decide that they lied to you and that's a reason to end the tenancy. So the discretionary grounds mean that we get to court and the judge still has a decision. The mandatory grounds, as long as you can provide the evidence that that is the issue, the judge must give you possession. So let's look now then at the introduction of the Ombudsman. So this is essentially the regulator for the industry for landlords. So again, we're moving towards that professionalism where lots of other industries have an ombudsman, the financial ombudsman, the energy ombudsman, all the things that you can complain to somebody if you're not treated fairly. So from now on, once this is introduced, a tenant can complain to the ombudsman and say, my landlord's done this, or probably not done this, and I don't think it's fair and I would like this to be resolved. The ombudsman will then investigate that. The tenant can complain for free, the landlord must pay to be a member, and the ombudsman will then rule on whether or not the issue is just and what the remedy is. So they might say, look, you have to apologise for turning up with no notice and you mustn't do it again. That might be the remedy. It might be that they require you to provide certain information, which might be personal information that you've held, emails that you've written about somebody, that sort of thing. It might be that they ask you to take remedial action if something's broken or not being maintained. Then they might, and these are binding decisions. So if the ombudsman says that is what you must do, then it's not advisory. It is a requirement that you do that action. How they will then enforce that is not yet clear. What teeth they have to fine you is not clear. But also they might ask you to provide compensation or any other remedy that they deem fit. What the government have said is that it would be unprecedented and inappropriate for landlords to use the ombudsman to complain about tenants. So interestingly, if the tenant is not doing something that they should be doing, the landlord cannot go to the ombudsman to get them to rule that the tenant must remedy their behaviour. But the government does say that they're exploring an alternative to that solution. Another sort of body that will be introduced is the private rental sector database. We're not yet sure exactly who's going to run this. It may be a government department, it may be a quango, maybe an arm's length organisation, we're not yet sure. It might be a private company like My Deposits that are given the job of running that database. Now, this is not dissimilar to what's been happening in Wales for a number of years, whereby each landlord will be required to register themselves as a landlord, and presumably if you have property in your own name and property in a limited company, you will have to register those two entities separately. And then each property will have to be registered as well, and presumably the properties will be linked to the landlord. The idea for this is that it's essentially like Trustpilot for landlords and properties. So a tenant, before they make an application, will be able to go on and check that you as a landlord are not known for being a bad landlord, and that the property they're interested in applying for is compliant. So our understanding is that it will require you to maintain, for example, things like the gas certificate, the electric certificate, the HMO license if it's HMO, PAT testing, all the things that we are required to maintain in a property. It will essentially be a portal, a bit like the EPC register, where the tenant can see in advance that this property is suitable for letting. There will be penalties if landlords put properties up for rent which are not registered on the database, and agents will, letting agents like us will probably do a lot of this work for you. Some will charge, we won't, because our model is not to charge for all these bits and pieces. But we will be fined equally if we're advertising a property that is not registered on the database. So that's something that we will need to check to ensure that you are compliant and we are compliant. And it is also intended to be what's called a one-stop shop for landlords to understand their obligations. So presumably then the government are going to put all of their information and guidance for landlords on this portal, on this database. And because you're registered on it, I suspect the terms and conditions will say that you've read and understood all of the information that's on there, and that if you make a mistake, it has to be on you because you've signed up to this database and therefore you know everything about being a landlord. The reality is that you can't know everything. Nobody can know everything. I think it will strengthen the attractiveness of working with a letting agency who are dealing with renting properties day to day, all day, every day. Now, of course, we don't necessarily know absolutely everything, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't make a mistake, but it does mean that we are dealing with these things all the time, and therefore we're much more likely to be able to help keep you compliant than if you've got one property that you let every 3 or 4 years, in which time that changes. And I think overall these changes, this legislation is really about professionalising landlording and moving sort of the landlords with 1 or 2 properties who, in their words, will often say, I'm just renting a property, I'm not a landlord. It's essentially moving those people out of the market, people who don't put money aside for maintenance, who don't necessarily know all of the things that they need to have in place to make their property safe and compliant. So this database comes in later in the year. It will be rolled out regionally, and we're not yet sure which region will be first, but as soon as we know it's affecting landlords that we manage for, we will be in touch with further guidance and an offer of help to register. The interesting question for me this raises as well is where landlords are in areas. So, for example, one of the areas we manage for in Coventry has additional licensing. So you've got a mandatory license for 5 or more occupants in a property, a HMO. In Coventry, if you have 3 or more tenants in a HMO, then you are required to register for an additional license. It will be very interesting to see whether that concept of additional and selective licensing becomes obsolete on the basis that essentially this database is a database of all landlords and all properties in the area. So the local authority shouldn't have to run their own licensing scheme. Whether or not they want to introduce additional requirements for those properties, so for example, some areas have minimum room sizes over and above the national minimum standards, remains to be seen. But yeah, let's see what effect this has on additional and selective licensing schemes across the country. When we talk about prohibiting rental discrimination, there are 3 main areas that this is looking to address. Tenants with pets, tenants with children, and tenants who are in receipt of universal credit or housing benefit. So for pets, it's quite clear that every tenancy has the right to request a pet. The NRLA have a really good pet policy, which we will adopt as a policy of our own. And they also have a pet request form, whereby the tenant must be very specific about what pet it is they are asking to keep. Now, in a single let property, with a family, a pet can be a real, really good addition to the family home. But the tenant must be clear about exactly what type of pet it is they're asking for. And the landlord must not reasonably refuse. So, for example, if you have a 3-bedroom house with a garden and you've got a dog, and you want to have a dog, it would be quite hard and you can prove that you can care for that dog properly. And some of the questions on the NRLA form are about, how long will the dog be left unattended, all these sorts of things. Has the dog been to training? So this information will then be used by the landlord to decide whether or not it's reasonable to allow the pet. If it is reasonable to allow the pet, then the landlord must allow the pet. And the reality is, most tenants who want a pet already have one. So this doesn't really change what's happening in reality. It just puts the onus on the tenant to request the pet and open the conversation. Interesting question is, if they don't request a pet but just move the animal in, are they then in breach of tenancy for not requesting? And is that a reason to then issue an eviction notice? I think it could be. Equally, you can't advertise. Sorry, just to finish off on pets, within a HMO, if you've got a flat, for example, let's say you've got a 1-bedroom flat on the 3rd floor, no garden, and you're asking for 2 German Shepherds to move in, then it's probably fair to say that that's an unreasonable request, and the landlord would have the right to say no. Same with children. So the idea is that you can't now, if you've got a 3-bedroom house, you can't say no, I'm not accepting a couple with a young baby. But if you've got a 1-bedroom property, it would be reasonable to say that somebody who applies with 3 children, that will cause overcrowding, and therefore that's the reason on which you're going to reject the application for that tenancy. Now, more specifically with HMOs, this will apply particularly for HMOs because often HMOs are quite an affordable way of living. They've become a residential option of choice for lots of people. Lots of people are choosing to live in HMOs because they don't have to maintain the property, they can move in without buying any furniture, all the bills are included, and therefore they know exactly what they're paying on the housing costs. But often HMOs have this sort of perception that they're for people who can't afford anything else, which is not the case, but it is a perception. And some landlords will take the view that they don't want people on housing benefit or universal credit because they're not in work. Maybe they're going to be sat in the house all day, using more electric, using more gas, and therefore they don't want to rent. And we see still at the moment adverts that say, no DSS, no benefits, blah, blah, blah. Now, to give some context to this, we have 3 parts to our managed portfolio. We have the vast majority of our rooms are over £500, mostly have en suites, and they're generally occupied by people who do go to work and have chosen to live in a HMO because it allows them either to save up for a property or to get to know the area, to decide whether they want to live there and settle before they go out and buy furniture and rent a flat and set up all their bills and everything. We then have a portfolio which is specifically designed when it was originally built in 30 years ago, where it is for people on benefits, and often it was for people that are coming out of prison or for whatever reason couldn't afford sort of the average market rent. And that portfolio is predominantly for people that are on housing benefits and universal credit. The rooms are not generally en suite, and therefore they are slightly lower in rental price, and they're much closer to the housing benefit and universal credit allowance, and therefore it's suitable, really suitable for those people to go into those rooms because they can afford it. There's then a bracket in the middle, which is in our area about £400 to £475 a month, which are often sort of HMOs that were developed 10, 15 years ago, often have shared facilities, so they're not as popular, they're a little bit more tired, They're obviously sharing facilities, so people aren't willing to pay as much for them. And they're often occupied by people who are in work but get a universal credit top up, or they're kind of just on the borderline of being affordable on universal credit if somebody is being paid their universal credit housing allowance in full. And what we find there is the vast majority of our low-level antisocial behaviour and our rent arrears and our sort of non-payment or partial payment of rent sits in that 400 to 475 bracket. And this is the bit where a lot of landlords will say, I don't want universal credit housing benefit, because they're not quite meeting the affordability. They're just meeting affordability, but it relies on them getting their universal credit paid every month. And that kind of person, and I'm speaking from experience here, not from aspersion, often will be the sorts of people that aren't in work all the time, and therefore they'll sort of be flicking between work, part-time work, 0 hours contract, and universal credit, and therefore payments are quite inconsistent. That's the bit where landlords often say no housing benefit or no DSS is often quoted, because the private rental sector rooms with the ensuites are way above universal credit and people know they can't afford them. So it really affects that middle bracket, sort of 400 to 475 pound. Now, what's been happening in our business, we've noticed lots of landlords have seen this coming. They've seen those properties become less profitable, and they've decided to come out of that market. They've converted them back into single let properties, or they've upgraded the property to have en suites and given it a full refresh. And what this is inadvertently doing is pushing those people on the cusp of kind of in and out of work, in and on and off of universal credit. It's reducing down the amount of rooms available to them, because they've either been taken out of the market altogether or they've been upgraded into ensuite rooms. And it's already starting to have an effect on the number of people turning up at the council's door looking for temporary accommodation because they don't have any other alternatives. So what this says is essentially somebody that can afford the room must have the right to view it. So if somebody can prove that they can pay £500 a month for a room, then we must show them and consider them as an applicant. It doesn't mean that just because they're on benefits, they can look at any room they want and that they must be considered or they must be rented to. So landlords will continue to have the final say and can carry out referencing checks to ensure that tenancies are sustainable. That's a quote from the legislation. But this is based on affordability. So if somebody cannot afford something, it's still perfectly reasonable to say no to that tenancy. It's also quite reasonable to say that you've got two applicants, one of whom is in full-time work and one of whom is not, and that you are choosing the one in full-time work because you believe that tenancy will be more sustainable. Now, the reality is that sometimes people lose their jobs for whatever reason, and that people on universal credit often are some of the best tenants because the universal credit gets paid every month. So in my experience, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I can see where landlords will want to sort of make that distinction, particularly on those rooms in the middle. So landlords will still have the right to choose, but what we cannot do is just indiscriminately say, if you're on benefits, you cannot see any room that you can afford, because if you can afford it, then you should be given the opportunity to apply for it. Lots of landlords also do this because their mortgage or their insurance will have a clause in there that says tenants must be in full-time work for whatever reason they've decided. Now, the government in this legislation are very clear that those terms cease to be of effect from the 1st of May. So if you're only saying that because your mortgage says it, from the 1st of May, you can accept people that are on universal credit, not in full-time work, even if that is a term in your insurance contract or your mortgage, because the government have said that those terms will become of no effect. This does only apply to England at the moment. Rent-A-Room only operates in England, but the government are pushing Wales and Scotland to follow suit, and I suspect they probably will do. Now, let's talk about rent in advance. So this, again, doesn't happen that often, but it is sometimes a case where if somebody's just on the borderline of affordability, the landlord will say, well, look, can you pay 3 or 4 months up front, give a bit of a buffer, and then if you do have a bit of a month where you can't pay in full, we've got some money on file that we can allocate onto credit. That must stop from the 1st of May. So you cannot make that a condition of a tenancy. You cannot ask the tenant to do that. The tenant may offer to do that, and they may put money on file, and they may pay in advance, but that money can only be allocated to rent when it's due. And if they move, let's say they pay 12 months up front and they live there for 8 months and they move out, you must then refund the 4 months because they've not lived there and therefore you're not entitled to use that money. And the tenant must have offered it to you or made an overpayment on their account. You cannot ask them to do that. The other place where this changes slightly is at the beginning of a tenancy as well. So often we will sign a contract when somebody's past referencing, maybe a week or so before they're due to move in, to secure the tenancy. To secure the tenancy for the tenant, but also the landlord knows that the tenant is committed to moving in. And at that point, we would say, please make a payment between now and moving in. So that we know, just sort of get the admin out of the way. We know that you've paid your first month and we can move you in on the day. That changes. So once the contract is agreed, the tenancy must begin. And this again is an interesting thing where a tenant gives notice and we then re-advertise the property. The tenant signs the contract, and then the existing tenant, for whatever reason, decides that they need another few days in the property. This then becomes quite a big issue because at that point you cannot allow the tenant to move in to the tenancy, to start the tenancy, but they've signed a contract. And that, I think, will be a bit of a change. So I think a lot of people will be signing the contract when they know the property is vacant, as opposed to when they believe the property will become vacant, but the current tenant still lives there. The other thing that changes is that once the tenancy is signed, the keys must be handed over on the day of tenancy, and you cannot make that conditional on the payment being made. So the rent becomes due, but if it's not been paid, the tenant must still be given the keys, and then you must expect them to make a payment, which is really the same as month 2 and onwards. You don't say, well, look, unless you pay on day 32 of your tenancy, I'm going to come and take the keys away. But it now applies on day 1. So you may end up in a situation where somebody doesn't pay for the first month, but they still are living in the property. Now, what we've got to look at here as well is intent. So the vast majority of tenants intend to move in, pay rent, maintain the tenancy correctly, give the correct notice and leave amicably. That is the majority of tenants' intentions. So please don't think that just because the tenant has the ability to do this or the permission to do this, that they will be able to do this, and that they will do this. It's not going to be the case. So we can take the deposit in advance. So that will obviously cover your first month, but we cannot demand any other money as a condition of moving in. What we will do is we will look for proof of funds, essentially. So we will ask the tenant to provide evidence that they're able to pay the first month's rent, but we cannot demand that they pay it across to us. So if you've downloaded the slides, there's an example here about sort of the dates and things in a specific example. The rental bidding, so this means that when you advertise a price, that is the price that the room must be let at or the house must be let at, and not more. You can, of course, accept an offer from a tenant which is lower than the advertised price, but this is essentially stopping the practice of rental bidding, which I think probably happens more in bigger cities where there's a huge demand, and also probably happens at certain times in the rental cycle where property is very popular, landlord puts it on the market, you get 10 or 20 people interested, and they think, right, okay, let's see how much we can get for this. The practice now must be that you declare the price at which that property can be rented, and then if you've got 5 people offering that price, you must choose between them, but that the factor that cannot be taken into consideration is whether anybody is prepared to pay any more than anybody else. You must rent it at the rent that you've advertised it at. There is a fairly hefty financial penalty of £7,000 if you were to do this, and the tenants can also challenge and take it to tribunal if the rent is increased during the tenancy unreasonably. Rent increases are now limited to once in a 12-month period, whereas previously you used to be able to increase the rent at the end of the fixed period, which might be just 6 months into the tenancy. Because obviously now those fixed periods don't exist, the government are saying that the rent cannot be increased more than 12 months, and it must be done with a formal notice. There is now one single way of increasing the rent, which is by serving a notice which lays out all the information the tenant needs. It must be done at least 2 months in advance so that the tenant has the information about what's going to happen to their rent. And they will be able to challenge the rent increase, which they can at the moment by going to a first tier tribunal, who will then decide whether or not the rent that's proposed by the landlord is fair based on market rate, or whether or not it should be lowered to what the tribunal feel is a fair rate. So what we will do as a company is we will look at these around about 10 weeks before the anniversary of the tenancy. We will suggest to the landlord the approach to take, and often our approach is that you should not really increase the rent. If it's at market rent and you've got a good tenant, we basically say, look, don't rock the boat, keep the good tenant, nothing's changed in your cost base, just hold steady and take it from there. Now, obviously, if your mortgage rate's gone up, if your gas and electric rate has gone up, then there are reasonable reasons to increase the rent. But you still can't increase it beyond market rate in the hope that somebody's going to stay because it's they're not going to leave because it's inconvenient. So they may challenge that and say, well, look, this isn't market rent. I'm going to go to the tribunal and we're going to see what they say about the rent increase. So what we will need to do is to provide more information about why we believe that rent is a fair market rate for that room. Now, obviously, being quite a large letting agency, we've got a lot of data about what people are paying, and we will also be able to reference what other landlords are marketing rooms for in the area. And we will look to agree this informally with the tenant, and then we will serve the notice and say, look, with reference to our conversation where we agreed that X amount is the new market rent, from date in 2 months' time, your rent will be increasing to this amount. Now, obviously, it's no coincidence that the notice period that tenants need to give is 2 months, the same as a rent review period that the landlord must give. And presumably, this is so that if the tenant doesn't want to pay a rent increase, they then have the opportunity to give the landlord notice to leave before that rent increase takes effect. Now, I think what will happen in reality, and our advice to landlords at the moment, is to hold steady. The majority of our rooms are rented at market value, and to be honest, the rents haven't really risen in the last 12 months. My suggestion would be to, if you've got rent reviews that are due, would be to hold on for now, wait until the autumn, because there will be quite a big marketing campaign by the likes of Shelter and the government to make tenants aware that they can challenge rent increases. So let's not go straight into the fire with tenants on that battle straight away. Rather, let's see what happens to the market rents, because I suspect with the restrictions on the rental bidding, what will happen is that a room that's maybe rented at £550 now, when that becomes available again, that will probably be rented at, let's advertise at £595, because the landlord knows that they can bring it down from that price, but if they re-advertise it at £550, they can't put it up. So if this happens in 3 or 4 months' time, we'll then be able to look at the market and we'll be able to say, well, actually, your room that's rented at £550 now, there are 3 of them being advertised at £595, and therefore that's the market rate. So if we want to increase the rent, we will have market data available to support the reason why we're looking to do that. So that will be my approach on rents. I would also say, let's have a look at your cost base. Let's look at your mortgage, your gas, your electric, whatever. If you're not making any money or your gas and electric bills are going up, it's a good opportunity to say to tenants now, we will be looking at your rent increases come the autumn. If the utility costs plateau or reduce, then we will not have to increase your rents as significantly as we might otherwise have to. So you're giving them an opportunity to change their behaviour to affect your cost base, to make sure that the rent reviews are not considered inappropriate. So that's how I would play that if I was advising, which I will be lots of you as HMO landlords. Renting with pets, we've already talked about this previously. So again, if you're running single lets, you probably are going to have to accept reasonable pets. If somebody wants to keep a giraffe in your house, that's probably not reasonable. But sort of normal domestic pets are going to have to be accepted. Now, in a HMO, that differs because obviously, if you've got an 8 square metre room that you're living in and you want the German Shepherd, that's probably not reasonable. And the government legislation is quite clear, the guidance is quite clear that that would not be a suitable pet for that size room. But also because you share communal areas with other people that are living areas as opposed to communal stairways in a block of flats, that contractors, cleaners, property managers or other tenants, present or future, may have allergies, and therefore it's much more reasonable for a landlord to refuse a request for pets post the 1st of May in a HMO. So every tenant will have the right to request a pet. We will use the NRLA pet policy as a guide, and we will ask them to fill in the NRLA pet request form, and then we will consider it. We will make a recommendation to the landlord, and then we will communicate the landlord's decision to the tenant. But I think really this is where the sort of media hype about tenants are going to have properties overrun with animals. Again, often people living in HMOs are doing so because they want to be footloose and fancy free. They don't want pets to look after. They're young, often single. They don't want those ties. So please don't think this is going to be a huge issue in our world. If you're renting single let properties, potentially it is something that is going to be more have more of an effect on you. It will also be reasonable, by the way, if you have let's say a flat in a block, and the block says the freeholder says that leaseholders are not allowed pets. That will be a reasonable grounds for refusal. The decent home standards, I touched on this earlier. Now, I know that the majority of our properties are way in excess of this standard, and I would certainly say that any property that Rent a Room manages will meet the decent home standards, because we will not accept poor quality accommodation on our books. But if your property is older and it doesn't necessarily needs a bit of maintenance, you might want to have a look at that. They're fairly reasonable standards to meet, but you will need to meet them, and there will need to be an expectation that they're maintained at that standard as well. Equally, damp and mould. Again, if you're in a single let property, there are property factors which affect damp and mould. You are responsible as the landlord for fixing them, but equally you need to explain to your tenants about not dry and washing, ventilating, opening the windows, all of these things. In a HMO, this becomes particularly pertinent because often tenants will dry clothes in their room because they don't have anywhere else to dry them. They don't want their underwear on a rack in the middle of a shared living room that they share with other people. That's pretty reasonable. So they will often put them on the radiators. So we've been going around making sure that all of the windows in all of the rooms have trickle vents. We will be issuing information to tenants about damp and mould. We'll be recording videos, giving them written information in lots of different languages. And we'll also be monitoring, which we already do, the Inspire thermostats, which we have in nearly all of our HMOs, to ensure that the temperature is not too hot. And again, we're asking landlords to provide us their gas and electric bills so that we can see whether or not there is indicators of behaviour which suggest that maybe somebody's using an electric heater, or the temperature's being boosted on the thermostat constantly, which might also indicate that there's an issue with the heating system, which we can then go in and look at and resolve and reduce running costs and reduce issues that tenants are having as well. Now, in terms of enforcement and regulations, there's already a lot of powers that the local authorities have to issue fines and issue improvement notices. A lot of these are basically just the fines are getting bigger. But I would say that our experience of working with a number of local authorities is that they do want to work with landlords. If there are issues, they want to identify the issues and give you a reasonable time frame in which to resolve them. But if you refuse or you are knowingly, deliberately letting out poor quality property, then they are more inclined to take action and deal with that. The one thing that changes which I think is an interesting dynamic, is that the local authority issuing the fines are now the body that retains the money from the fines. So there is now an incentive for local authorities to potentially fine a little bit sooner if they want to have the money to be able to afford more enforcement officers. And I would say that's a good thing, as long as it's levied fairly and as long as the fines are used to continue to improve enforcement on really bad quality properties, then I don't see that as a bad thing, because it will overall increase the quality of the rental sector, which is what professional landlords will want to do alongside the government. So there's some information here again. I'll give credit to the NRLA. This is information on their website. You'll be able to download the slides or see the information on their website about the offences and the fines that can be levied, the starting point. So some of even the starting points are pretty chunky amounts of money, and the maximum penalties have often, in many cases, increased as well. Rent repayment orders. So if you have an issue in your property where you've not managed the tenancy correctly, the tenants currently have quite a few rights to ask for their money back. These rights are being extended so that the amount of rent they can claim back doubles, so they can claim up to 2 years worth of rent back, and they've got longer after the offence to start the proceedings to the tribunal to ask for their money back. There's also a clarification in this legislation that directors of limited companies become personally liable. So please don't think that just because you bought a company with older property in it that you're not liable. If you're a director of that company, like with lots of other things and lots of other responsibilities that come with that, you will be held accountable, and the fines will be for you, not just your company. And also superior landlords, if you've got a property that you've done a rent to rent on, you are now just as liable for any mistakes or inadequacies for your rent to rent operator. So I would check really carefully that they are reputable, experienced, and they understand the responsibilities of being a landlord, because you are essentially guaranteeing their knowledge. So again, there are some additional rent repayment order offences, which essentially are all the things that are new in the Renters' Rights Act. Responsibilities for registering for the Ombudsman, registering for the database, marketing when you know that you shouldn't have done it because you've asked the tenant to leave when you shouldn't have done. Essentially, they all become rent repayment order offences as well. So this is the point where if we're doing a consultation with you as one of our existing landlord clients, we will ask you your thoughts and your questions, and we will do our best to answer those. If you're not already a landlord client of ours, but you think you'd like to be, then pop on our website, have a look, get in touch, and let's have that conversation. If you are one of our landlords and you're about to have one of these consultation calls, we will also be looking at the following things. We will consider any tenants that you've got with rent arrears and whether or not it might be suitable to issue them a Section 21 notice in the last couple of weeks whilst we still can. We will discuss any tenants causing low-level antisocial behaviour and whether or not it is time to ask them to leave with a Section 21 whilst we still can. We will also look at if we have already issued Section 8 or 21 notices on your behalf, how long they have left to run, with obviously that long stop deadline of the end of July being the last point at which you can use them to go to court, and whether or not we are going to proceed to do that. We will look at your most recent property inspection to flag any potential maintenance issues, discuss any live issues, and any proactive maintenance that we think we might be able to do to help reduce your running costs. In particular, we're really keen at the moment to see your gas and electric bills. We've done quite a lot of analysis of our own portfolio, over 150 rooms, and also a number of other landlords that we've already had these conversations with. We've got a really good baseline now of what the gas and electric should come to per tenant per week over the course of a year. And we're seeing that some properties have significantly higher running costs than that average. We're looking at the reasons for that. We've already identified with one landlord that the boiler didn't have a MagnaClean fitted when it was installed 7 years ago. There's so much sludge in the system that the boiler is becoming practically ineffective. Essentially, there is no heating system. For £500 power flush and £250 Magna Clean, we've got that property back up to full efficiency, and we are expecting that to save the landlord between £500 and £800 a year. So essentially a 100% return on investment, reducing your running costs and increasing your profitability. These are the things that, as a proactive managing agent, as a HMO specialist, we want to be working with you, not just renting your property out and collecting the rent, passing it on. We want to partner with you and make sure that we are helping you make sure these properties are as profitable as possible, because that's why you bought them as an investment. We will also check that you are within date of your mandatory additional or selective license. We'll make sure that all of your conditions are still being complied with, and check the expiry date so that you know when the process to renew that license will begin. We will also recommend to you and talk you through the process of registering with the Information Commissioner's Office. We are aware of a couple of landlords who've been criticised and fined for not being registered with the Commissioner's Office. There's been a bit of a grey area whether that's definitely required, but essentially, because you are have access to your tenant's personal information by virtue of your contract or your access to the portal, although we're registered, we do think that you probably need to be. That's £35 a year if you pay by direct debit. It's a simple registration, an acknowledgement of the principles of data protection, and basically a commitment to uphold those principles. So if you're a landlord with us at the moment, you've watched this video, if you've not yet booked your call, please book your call in with myself and your property manager. If you have got your call booked in, then we're really looking forward to talking with you and helping you understand these changes and making sure that your property is performing as well as it can do. If you're not yet a client of ours and you would like to be, or you think you might like to be, please book a call with us. Let's have a conversation and let's see if we can make sure that your property is performing as well as possible. Thank you very much. Please do not worry about these changes. We will be here to help you understand them and work through them. And whether we're a client or not at the moment, I look forward to speaking with you in the future. Thank you very much.